Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We've got 80 people here so far, and I think we'll have a lot more people joining. My name is Michelle, and I'm a book conservator in the Preservation Unit here at the San Francisco Public Library. I'm joined today by my colleague Elise, another conservator from the Preservation Unit, and Patrick, who's the Digitization Projects Librarian in the Digi Center here at SFPL. Our colleague Emily is also here in the background helping out. Today is Ask a Conservator Day. Conservators are professionals whose primary occupation is the preservation of cultural property for the future. Here at SFPL, our jobs involve preserving and repairing the library's reference and special collections, as well as the city's archives, and maintaining the library's digital collections. Ask a Conservator Day commemorates the flooding of Florence, Italy on November 4th, 1966, which damaged priceless cultural heritage. In response to the catastrophe, incredible efforts were made to conserve items impacted by the flood. The disaster sparked many conservation careers as more people became aware of the field. Ask a Conservator Day follows in the spirit of that international collaboration and exchange of knowledge by creating an opportunity for people to engage with conservators. Our program today is about preserving your personal collections. The first half will focus on preserving physical collections, books, paper, and photographs, and the second half will focus on digital preservation. This program is being recorded, and the recording link will be shared with everyone who registered. Closed captioning is available and can be enabled by clicking the CC icon in the meeting controls toolbar. We're in a Zoom webinar format, so you will not be able to unmute, but we encourage you to use the chat feature if you have comments. And for any questions, please use the Q&A feature so that your question doesn't get buried in the chat. We have set aside time for answering questions, and we hope to get to all of them. Before we begin talking about preserving the past, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The San Francisco Public Library Commission acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that the Ramaytush Ohlone understand the interconnectedness of all things and have maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples for their enduring commitment to Mother Earth. As the indigenous protectors of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. We recognize that to respectfully honor Ramaytush peoples, we must embrace and collaborate meaningfully to record Indigenous knowledge and how we care for San Francisco and all its people. As we talk today about preserving our physical and digital heritage collections, I want to also emphasize the importance of preserving intangible heritage, such as oral histories, folklore, traditions, and languages, particularly for communities who have experienced or are currently experiencing displacement and violence. So as I mentioned, we'll start with physical materials. We'll cover tips for safely storing your collections and what kind of storage materials we recommend or don't recommend. How to preserve the information connected to your photos and documents. How to safely handle your collections. Special considerations for photo albums and scrapbooks. How to care for rare and special books, and how to prevent and address water damage and mold.
If you do nothing else, paying attention to the environment in which you store your collections is the most consequential tool you have to ensure that they survive into the future. If you have loose materials, keep those items together in folders, ideally with some system of organization. Store folders in boxes or plastic bins, and of course, label the containers. Keep your collections in a clean indoor space and out of direct sunlight. The area that you choose should ideally maintain a stable temperature and relative humidity. This most often means you should avoid attics, basements, garages, sheds, and outdoor spaces if at all possible. As many of us probably know all too well, these spaces can be prone to leaks, flooding, environmental fluctuations, and pests, and they often go unattended for long periods of time. It is very important to lay eyes on your collections and observe the conditions of the environment in which they are being stored periodically so that you can catch and address issues early or prevent them from occurring at all. The standard for collections of paper and books in libraries and museums is approximately 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 50% relative humidity. This standard is really based on human comfort. So a helpful rule of thumb is that if your storage space is uncomfortable for you, like your hot attic, for example, it's probably not safe for your collections. Don't worry too much about storage spaces being too cold, as long as the humidity is low. Lower temperatures and relative humidity below 50% are best for photographs and film negatives to slow deterioration. So if you have to put something in the attic, make sure it's not your photographs. These benchmarks may sound difficult to monitor or achieve, but with some relatively cheap equipment, like a dehumidifier, a fan, and a temperature and humidity monitor, you can reduce the impact of extreme fluctuations on your collections. Remember that perfect stability is not necessary, and trying to chase it can be a drain on your time and resources. Seasonal fluctuations in a moderate climate like Northern California are generally fine. Although be aware of any spaces in your home that you may have that tend to be damp in winter. The takeaway here is to do the best you can and most importantly, maintain awareness of your spaces. There are lots and lots of different options when it comes to storage materials. As I talk about these various options, remember that the right solution for you and your situation and collection may not perfectly align with museum and library standards. There are many different factors to consider, most importantly, your budget and space limitations. First, I'll mention the ideal storage materials, then I'll talk about options that may be more practical and budget friendly. The best options for storage materials come from established archival suppliers who carry materials that are chemically stable. This means that they do not contain additives that could cause harm to collections. Unsurprisingly, these materials are the most expensive. If you have the budget, we recommend the following supplier of archival products: Gaylord, Archival Products, University Products, and Hollinger Metal Edge. And Emily has dropped those links into the chat. More common storage materials that you may already have at home are perfectly serviceable too, like standard office file folders, preferably tan rather than green, banker's boxes, and waterproof plastic tubs. I have recently gotten in the habit of saving any Tyvek mailing envelopes that I receive in the mail. Tyvek is a great preservation quality material that is extremely durable and water resistant. So if you get any of those at home, you should save them. These envelopes are a great option for storing photographs and loose documents. Just make sure that you cut off the part of the envelope with the self-adhesive strip so that it doesn't stick to your materials. Okay, now for some don'ts. When storing your collections, remember to avoid anything that rusts and anything sticky. While useful for recording notes, Post-its should not be stuck directly to items in your collection. Also, avoid wrapping materials in newsprint. Newsprint is highly acidic and can damage material that it comes into contact with. If newspapers or loose news clippings are a part of your collection, try to isolate those from other materials. Don't use colored paper or folders. They can bleed dye if they get wet. Paper clips and staples can rust over time and can permanently damage materials that they come into contact with. This is also true for rubber bands and any kind of tape. Lastly, try not to use binders or anything made of vinyl. These are made of soft PVC plastic, which is not chemically stable and can degrade nearby materials over time.
We have a question in the Q&A that I think is a little bit relevant to storage. So someone has said, I've been keeping memory boxes for myself and my family for decades. My greatest fear is a fire destroying everything I hold dear. Any advice? I'll let Elise weigh in on this too. I don't know what the volume of boxes that you have. The person who sent in this question, if it's filling up a shelf, obviously you're not going to be able to run out of the house with all of those if there's a fire. But if it's a small amount of material, you may be able to keep some of those items in a place, maybe where you keep other things that you would grab in an emergency to leave quickly with. But I think knowing where they are is helpful, and kind of having a plan if you, I mean, most people don't have fire suppression systems in their home like you would have in a museum or an institution, but I don't know. I'll keep thinking about that. Elise, do you have any other thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, one of the most important ways that you can safeguard your materials from a fire or any kind of material destruction is digitization. So Patrick will talk a little bit about that, but a digital object is not a substitute to the real tangible thing, but
Mhm.
it can certainly help us hold on to those memories in case they're lost.
Yeah, and this is something Patrick will talk about with digital collections, about storing things in multiple places. So having the physical object and then also the digital object, and then, assuming your digital object is not only stored on hard drives in your home, but is also in the cloud, then, it can be protected in the case of a fire. And I just want to remind people when you're typing in the chat, if you want everyone to be able to see your questions, make sure you address it to everyone and not just host and panelists. And Emily, I don't know if you can change this for me, but I actually can't address everyone in the chat. I can only send messages to hosts and panelists. So I'm not sure if that setting could be changed, um, but I just thought I would mention it. Okay, we'll keep going. Preserving information is an important aspect of all this that can be easy to forget. Maybe we've all had the experience of finding an old family photo and realizing that someone wrote detailed information on the back with the date and place the photo was taken and the full name of everyone in the photo. And you felt so grateful because you never would have known otherwise. And maybe we've all had the reverse experience of finding albums full of people you don't recognize, and you know that everyone who knew them is now gone and the information is lost forever. Has anyone had experiences like this? Please feel free to share in the chat. For myself, a few years ago, my husband and I made an album of old photos for his father as a gift for his birthday. We scanned in all the photographs and we had the book printed by an online company. And it wasn't until we gave him the album that we learned that the full page photo we had included of his mother as a young woman was actually his aunt. We had a laugh about it, but if he hadn't been there to tell us, we would have never known our mistake. You can see that this photo on the slide was written on with what was probably a ballpoint pen, and we've probably all done this, but we recommend using a soft pencil. Pen might seem more permanent, but inks can fade while pencil will not. Markers can also sometimes bleed through, and wet inks can transfer to other items. Be sure to also label your containers. The more detail, the better. You'll thank yourself later. We also recommend making a list of what you have, especially when it comes to important family papers. This can also allow you to include more detail than you might want to write on the back of a photo or document. It will be very helpful if your collection is passed on to someone else one day. And we've got someone in the chat who has asked the best way to identify people in a photograph. And so yeah, there's a few ways you could approach this. If you are pretty sure that it's family members, I would definitely recommend, taking a photo of it with your phone, sending it to everyone in your family to kind of crowdsource that information, among your family. But I've also seen people crowdsource this to the broader internet. They might post the photograph on Facebook or on Instagram. I wouldn't be surprised if there's Reddit threads for this to try and get just members of the public to help identify people in photographs. Historical societies might also be able to help. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Elise.
I'm just going to hop in as well and say that even if you don't know the name or age of a specific person, even vague information at the time is going to be forgotten. So if you know the place or within the decade when something was from, that even that is very valuable information to still transcribe and keep with the object and may help someone in the future further identify.
And that was Emily just then. I know you all can't see her name popping up. Elise, did you have anything or?
Um, Using these, there are certain libraries, if you live in San Francisco, then the Sutro Library is part of the State Library of California, and it's free and open to the public, and you can go there and use genealogy resources that are online that you would otherwise need a a subscription to access. So I would recommend going there using Ancestry.com, which you can also use here at San Francisco Public Library for free. Um, but it's tough.
And I'm seeing a question in the chat. Some people may have joined later and missed this, but this program's being recorded. A link will be sent to everyone who registered, and we'll also be sharing PDFs of our slides. Someone asked about handouts. So that'll be sent to you later. I'm going to go ahead into the next slide.
If the only consideration when talking about collection preservation was longevity, we would recommend putting your objects in a temperature and humidity controlled safe and throwing away the key. This solution robs us of the joy of maintaining, experiencing, and sharing our personal collections, though. So here are some things to remember when handling your items. Handle your objects sparingly. Every time you pick up a book or unfold a delicate letter, you introduce the potential for damage. When you do choose to handle these precious objects, be intentional and careful. Always handle items on a clean and dry surface. This is especially important for paper-based collections, which are extremely sensitive to moisture. I always not only do I visually check to see if it's clean, I also just clean a surface when I'm about to handle objects that are very precious or rare. There may be oils, things that are imperceptible to you that could transfer onto your object. So just go ahead and take the extra step of cleaning any surface that you're using. And now to wade into a potentially controversial subject, to glove or not to glove. It may surprise you to know that book and paper specialists recommend clean hands and not gloves when handling rare, valuable, or special items. Gloves can reduce tactile sensitivity, which is dangerous when handling fragile and delicate paper. Any natural oils on your hands that might be present after you have washed them is not significant enough to cause damage to the paper itself. There was a great article in the New York Times about this from March of last year, March of 2023. It's called "For Rare Book Librarians, It's Gloves Off." Seriously. And Emily will drop a link to that article in the chat. I highly recommend it. Now, there are some exceptions to this no gloves rule. Photographic emulsions are very sensitive to the oils in your skin. The photographic emulsion is the image side of a photograph. They're very sensitive to the oils in your skin. So consider wearing well-fitting gloves when handling photographic prints or negatives. If you don't have gloves handy, that's okay too. You can hold the photograph or negative film by the edges and avoid touching the surface. This image in the slide demonstrates the best way to hold photographs whether or not you are wearing gloves. Also, if any health hazard is suspected, like mold, for example, always protect yourself by wearing gloves. We recommend nitrile gloves like those shown here.
All right, so we've had a few questions come in about photo albums, so I think those will be answered somewhat from my notes here, but I'll say more after I've gone through the slide. Photo albums and scrapbooks are something that many of us have in our homes that can be challenging to preserve. They're often bulky and heavy. Sometimes things are falling out. They might contain all kinds of materials, newspaper clippings, pressed flowers, metal and plastic bits, and lots of adhesive. They're also very rich in information and important to take care of. Like Elise said, we want to avoid touching the surface of photographs, so exercise care when turning pages. If the album is fragile or falling apart, you can provide support so that you aren't forcing the binding open and causing more damage. You can use small pillows or rolled up towels to keep the book from opening all the way flat. So what I mean is that you might want to avoid the book opening all the way open like this if it's really fragile, and you can use things to support it so it stays open at a 90-degree angle or something less than 180. If things are falling out, we recommend keeping them where they are and storing the album flat inside a box. You can get boxes from the suppliers that Elise mentioned earlier. If you're putting together a new album or scrapbook, we recommend using photo corners so that you can avoid putting adhesive directly on your photos. The type of photo album in this slide is probably familiar to everyone. This is sometimes called a magnetic album. It has sticky pages with a plastic cover on each page. These are kind of bad news, and all of my childhood photos are in albums like this. Where the page edges have turned brown, that's where the adhesive has failed. The deterioration starts at the edges, where there's more exposure to light, oxygen, and humidity. If the adhesive completely fails, then you can just take all the photos out and put them in a new, more stable album with photo corners. But it's tricky. This adhesive will actually get stickier before it fails completely. So if you decide to take photos out of an album like this, be very careful and don't force anything or you might tear the photo. Personally, I'm leaving my magnetic albums as they are, but I have plans to scan each page. And so there's a few questions in here about photo albums. One person asked, what's a good way to DIY a wedding photo album without using one of these incredibly expensive online services? What types of materials would you recommend? I made an album for a relative of mine for their wedding where I printed the photographs from an online printing service and then used photo corners. And probably most people are familiar with those, but they're usually made out of paper. You can get them out of other materials. And the corners have adhesive on the back of them, so they stick to the page, but then your photo just gets tucked into the corner, so there's no adhesive on the photograph. So you could get a blank album. You want something that the binding has extra space to accommodate for the pages getting thicker as you add more photos. You know, it might be a wash on whether that ends up being cheaper than just having a photo book made by an online company. I mean, there's a pretty wide range of price options with those. But I hope that's a helpful tip. Maybe the other ones I already answered, and so they're gone. I did see a question from someone just while we're talking about family photos and albums that says, I find it difficult to organize people and family relationships. Is there a tip for doing this clearly? I think that this question is about genealogy research. If it's not, please maybe rephrase it and send the question again. But I will say we're not really going to cover how to do genealogy research in this workshop because we're focused more on preserving either the physical materials or the digital files, but not really so much about the research aspect. So I think that's what that question is about. The library does offer workshops on genealogy. Maybe Elise could mention. I know you've helped teach one before. Does that happen regularly, Elise?
It is. The plan is for it to happen annually. There was a all-day genealogy workshop that was hosted by the library, actually by Richard Lee, who's the branch manager at North Beach, and he's I would recommend reaching out to him to do any kind of local genealogical research for one thing. But anyway,
Okay.
that workshop happened in May, and I believe there's plans to do it again in May 2025.
So the person posted in the chat and they said their question is about storage and keeping the information in order. I did talk about, labeling photographs, putting things in folders and then labeling the folders, having other documents that list all the things that you have with additional information about them. You could, keep a spreadsheet of the different documents that you have, but I think really as far as organization systems, some of this is more about like personal archiving. I saw Emily shared a link earlier from Library of Congress about personal archives. Maybe that will have some tips. Elise and I are not archivists, we're conservators, but we do have some training in those areas. But I think for a personal collection, really the system that works best for you is the best system to use, something that makes sense to you. But do keep in mind if you might be passing that collection to someone else, you want to make sure you've included enough information that it will make sense to another person looking at it. I hope that that's helpful. Feel free to ask add more detail to your question if you'd like.
Um,
Um,
Before we move
oh,
on from photos, we do have another question in the Q&A. On photos or other precious docs, is decoupage ever recommended? And I think by decoupage, what you mean is gluing uh, these objects to some sort of substrate and then sealing it. Although I'm not 100% sure if that's what this person is asking about. If in general, we do not recommend ever applying any kind of adhesive or sticky substance to your photographs or documents, and that's because sometimes it can be irreversible and cause damage to those items. So that's not recommended.
but we do recommend reproducing them and making all
Yes,
kinds of cool crafts and collages with
right.
your items, just not the originals.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, right. Using a lacquer. In general, no. In general, no. It's different if you're treating your objects more like, an art piece. And in that situation, you know, there are different considerations. The content and meaning of the work changes, then it becomes less about the original objects and more about the final piece. So if we're talking strictly long-term preservation, then no.
And there's a question in the chat about photo corners. So again, the photo corners adhere to the page, but they do not adhere to your object. So they're just physically holding it in. The photo gets tucked into the corners, but there's no adhesive between the photo corner and the object. I've seen a couple people ask about plastic sleeves. So we're trying to not get too much into the weeds, but some plastics are safer than others to be in contact with materials. The most stable plastic is polyester. When that's in a film, a proprietary name for it is Mylar in the US at least. So Mylar is a really stable plastic. That's something that you can look for. If you're trying to purchase, you're really trying to purchase archival materials to store your photographs in, something that you can look for, and maybe Emily can put a link in the chat or just write this out, but look for things that say that they're PAT tested. That's PAT, the photograph activity test. And this is, file folders are fine. Not everybody needs to be getting into this much detail, but if that's something you're really interested in and you're storing a lot of photographs and you're going to buy something just for that, that's a standard that people use where the material has been tested to see how reactive it is with different types of materials that are found in photographs. Because photographs not printed digitally, but real photographs have metals and other materials in them that can be reactive to certain types of paper and other chemicals. Someone has asked about handmade paper as a choice for individual sheets of album material. I don't see any problem with that. The other question about how to put an album together was about trying to reduce cost. So that would be maybe a higher cost. The album I mentioned earlier that I made for a family member, I used Reeves BFK paper. It's a printmaking paper that's made of cotton rag. But so it's not a handmade paper, but handmade paper is an option.
You'd still want to be aware of any kind of additives that went into the paper making process if it is handmade.
It's true. And if this is a new album with new photos, these are probably digital prints. They're not containing metals and other things like historic photographs would. Just gonna look through. Okay. Give me just 1 second, just getting us caught up a little bit here. Okay, I think we'll keep going, and I know there's still more questions. We're gonna get to any that we haven't answered at the end. Go ahead, Elise.
Um, by rare and special books, we also want to acknowledge that there may be books in your collection that hold more personal significance than they do monetary value, like family Bibles, grandma's old cookbook with her notes in the margins, or the scrapbooks and photo albums that Michelle just talked about and many of you in the chat also mentioned. Does anyone here have a book like that in their collection? We would love it if you told us about it in the chat. I have a book like that in my family. My maternal grandmother died when my mom was very young, and the only artifact that my mom still has with her mother's handwriting is in a copy of Moby Dick. This particular copy of Moby Dick is not a first edition, nor is it signed by Melville, but nonetheless, it is of extraordinary personal value to my mom. Several years ago, I made a custom box for this book to protect it from further light damage and abrasion. This is the ideal preservation solution for storing books, so it's worth considering in some cases. However, it's not always necessary or practical. It is best to store books on a shelf and supported in an upright position by neighboring books. Avoid keeping rare and special books on display on coffee tables, in kitchens, or in bathrooms. They need to be protected from food, liquids, oils and grease, and excessive humidity fluctuations. Old and or frequently handled books often suffer from detached covers and loose leaves. If this is the case, be sure to keep any detached part with the book so that it doesn't get lost, but don't use a rubber band. Finally, if the book needs repair in order to be stabilized and safely handled, we do recommend contacting a professional conservator. And I just want to call out one note that I see in the chat. Donna says, I have my grandfather's study book for American citizenship with his notes in the margins. Yeah, that is exactly the kind of book we're talking about.
So I'm guessing that many of us here have dealt with mold in our homes. I know I have. It's a really common problem and can be very stressful. Mold spores are everywhere, and if the conditions are right, mold will always grow. Prevention is key. So keeping the relative humidity in your home below 60% will help keep mold from growing. But many of us live in older homes without effective HVAC, so we have places in our houses that stay cool and damp and very friendly to mold. Keeping your collections off of the floor and away from any areas you know to be damp is a good idea. If you have a flood in your home, whether from a leaky roof or a burst pipe, respond quickly. Know where your most important things are and make sure that they're safe. If papers or photographs become wet, separate them and lay them flat to dry with photos face up. Stand books on their edge and fan out the pages like in this photo. These are books from special collections here at SFPL that got wet from a leak a couple of years ago, so it happens to us too. Keep air flowing with fans and use a dehumidifier if you have one. If you do encounter mold, protect yourself with PPE or personal protective equipment. That means gloves, mask, apron, eye protection. Your health is more important than any object. Separate out any moldy items and quarantine them in sealed plastic bags. Discard things that can be replaced, and we recommend contacting a professional to help deal with everything else.
Here are some resource links, which we will share in the chat. The first is for the American Institute for Conservation, the main professional organization for conservators in the United States. Their website has many resources for the public, including downloadable caring for your treasures guides, as well as a find a professional tool for locating a conservator in your area should you need to hire a professional.
And we've got some more questions in the Q&A that we'll go through now, and feel free to add more questions that you've got. So a couple people have asked about newspapers. One person asked, what's the best way to save newspaper clippings? And another person asked how to best preserve important newspapers of historical events. So both these things are about newsprint, but if you just have a little clipping of a newspaper that's just this big, you might store that in a different way than an entire newspaper. A lot of the archival suppliers that we sent links to earlier will sell things that they call newspaper boxes. You can search for that, and they're a good size for like a full-size paper that's folded in half. And those are just archival boxes, and it helps the, newsprint gets brittle as it ages, so that the box will help it not get crushed, not help the edges not get banged up, if you just had it in a bag or something. If you have a single clipping, that can be safely stored in a folder. We talked about Mylar earlier. That's polyester film plastic. You can find Mylar sleeves on some of these. Earlier, someone asked about plastic sheet protectors, and I know I talked about that a little bit, but the kind that you might get with like the 3-hole that comes in a binder, a lot of those plastics, either we don't know what they are or they might be an unstable plastic. So if you already have them and you use them, you don't need to rehouse everything that you've got, but I wouldn't recommend purchasing those intentionally for storage if you're not already using them. I would recommend either folders or using Mylar. If it's a small clipping, so small that you don't have to unfold it to look at it, Mylar is really great because then you don't have to touch it. You can just flip the plastic over and it protects it really well. But sometimes the clippings are really long and they're all folded up, so then a folder might be better, because then you just open the folder and you can open it up and you're not having to like slide it in and out of a Mylar pocket. Yeah, newsprint is a really sensitive material. It was made to last a day or a week. That's the nature of newspapers. But of course we have things from them that we want to save forever, but that's why it's falling apart. That paper wasn't engineered to last forever. It's acidic. It has a lot of lignin in it. That's a material from the trees that was used to make that paper. The more light exposure, the more higher temperatures, the more humidity it's exposed to or has already been exposed to, the faster it will age. It'll darken. It'll turn brittle. It gets crumbly. Elise probably has other things to add, but
It's important to remember with newsprint in particular that, like Michelle said, it is ephemera. Even though we're trying to keep it for hundreds of years, it is essentially ephemera. And we can't stop these chemical reactions that are already occurring. So even if you do everything correctly, it won't last forever. So digitization is the only way to ensure that these clippings and newspapers are saved in multiple different formats that may have the best chance of long-term survival.
I'll add too, many of you, maybe you've done this or you've seen someone has saved a newspaper clipping in a book. And this can be a really nice way to save newspaper clippings because it keeps it flat. It reduces the oxygen and light exposure because it's closed up in the book. But then you might also see that the newsprint has stained the book and you have now like an orange rectangle where the newsprint was. So that's just something to keep in mind, if you are storing newsprint clippings and books, if the book is really important to you, that's something that can happen. We see it all the time when we get books into repair. Maybe the newsprint isn't even there anymore, but we can tell there was a clipping in there because it's just like a brown rectangle.
Yeah, I mentioned it in an earlier slide. If you do have news clippings as a part of your collection and it's feasible for you, try to quarantine them from other collection items if you can, and it won't disturb the original order that may exist in the collection too much.
Someone in the Q&A has asked about storing oversized items or oversized newspaper clippings. So I was talking earlier about how sometimes clippings, they're from a really big newspaper, they're all folded up. If it's already got creases, depending on your storage situation, I think it can be okay to keep storing it folded and then just carefully open it when you need to access it, because it might not be practical to buy a really long box for your clipping and then be trying to store that. So I think you have to, consider the rest of your collections. But so I can tell you, what we do in the library. We have flat file drawers. So sometimes these are called map drawers. So it's, imagine a filing cabinet, but the drawers are really, really wide and really narrow. If you've ever bought paper at an art supply store, you may have seen these kind of flat file drawers. If you're an artist or a printmaker, you might have some. These are really wonderful for storing big oversized things. That's what we use in the library, but some things are even too big for the drawers. So we do sometimes store things rolled. But when we roll things up, we try to keep it at a larger diameter. So, you see poster tubes that are this big, but if it's rolled that tiny, it's a lot of stress on the paper and can be really hard to unroll it. So, at least 3 inches bigger is even better, if you're going to be rolling something, but it's not always practical for the storage environment. If something, I said this with the clippings, but if it already has creases in it and it's folded, it may be safer to just keep storing it folded, rather than trying to open it up really big and then it's easy to get damaged. Another thing to consider is framing. Can be a way to protect large items. Framing can be very expensive, but if it's something that you're wanting to display, I wouldn't recommend it with newsprint. It's too much light exposure. Even if you have glass that's blocking UV, it's the visible light can still cause damage. Yeah, I wouldn't frame and display newsprint, but um, anything else, Elise? Oversize?
That's all I can think of.
Okay. Um, so someone asked about humidity tool. Emily, I can't tell if you're trying to type an answer what's happening, but I'm just going to go ahead and answer that. You can find environmental loggers online. Hobo is a brand that we use. Maybe Emily can share a link, but just even one that you buy for like a reptile cage, you can find them really cheap on the internet to measure humidity, digital ones. That's something that is just so much easier to do now than it was a few decades ago. Um, more expensive ones may be more accurate, but if you're concerned about that, you could get two or try to calibrate it, but it'll give you a general idea. Isn't it best to photocopy the article onto archival paper and save that? Asked someone. I think it would just depend. It would depend on what you're using it for. Yeah, I mean, once you've got a photocopy, that isn't the object. So now it's something else. There is value in original objects, so that's why we save them. I think, especially now with the tools we have for digitization, saving the original and a digital copy is more common than reformatting onto a different type of paper and saving that. But
It's
yeah,
certainly useful if your primary goal is to save the information
yeah,
and the information only, but in a reproduction like that, a material reproduction, you lose a lot of information that may be about the paper that the image or text was printed on, the manner of printing. We can tell by looking at using a very simple microscope and light. We can sometimes tell the technique that was used to make a print or to print text.
yeah.
So you're losing a lot when you do it that way, but it could be useful. In fact, and in fact, it is useful to have many different formats to
Hmm.
save in many different formats and many different locations, especially if your primary goal is to save just the information. But
Yeah, we're interested in the type of paper and how things
yeah,
are printed, but that may be not be why you're saving the newspaper clipping. And yeah, I just think if you've already got it on the scanner, then definitely save the digital file, and you can
mhm.
print physical copies to share with your family and to look at for yourself. Um, we're gonna hand it over to Patrick in about 12 minutes, but we have more time. I still see more questions coming in. So someone has asked, how can I restore an old picture or fix it? Any tools or apps that I can use? Um, I would say that that is kind of outside the scope of the work that we do. We don't typically do like digital retouching or restoration typically. There are companies that offer that. I imagine there may be some workshops and tools online, but that's, yeah, maybe a little bit outside the scope of what we're covering here. But I would say that that is a really great option if you've got a photograph that's damaged, rather than trying to hire someone to, retouch your actual photograph. They can digitize it, and there's a lot that they can do. um, Many photo conservators offer these services, and others do too. As far as DIY, I think that's probably a skill set that probably takes some time to learn to do well, since it's a skill that people have, professionally and um, do as their job. But someone is asking, best way to preserve old letters written in ink from the 1850s. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of covered by the things we've already talked about, how you would safely store documents. I don't think there's anything different about that than the things we've already said. Storing them in folders or in sleeves, handling them sparingly. If it's something that you think you want to spend a lot of time reading and looking at, scan it and use the digital copy instead of the physical one.
Um,
But yeah, protecting them from light exposure. Go ahead, Elise, sorry.
well, one thing I will say, and this may be a little bit too in the weeds, but 1850s the 1850s was sort of a critical period in book arts history, because that is right around the time when paper making shifted from a handmade process to an industrial machine process. And so at that point, a lot of additives had to be added to paper because wood pulp was being used. And so if this is the case with the letters that you're talking about, probably they're very brittle, and potentially much more acidic than if they were made 20 or 30, or if they were written on paper made 20 or 30 years in the past, prior. So anyway, just an interesting historical note.
Yeah, and it could really go either way at that time because it's a
Yeah.
transition period. I think stationery quality maybe hung on a little longer than, book paper and some others, but
Hmm.
um okay. Yeah, some of these I can't tell again if Emily's in the process of answering them, but someone asks, what if you have no choice but to store in a garage or storage facility? Do you have suggestions for keeping items in more stable shape? If you're storing it in a storage facility, find one that's climate controlled, if at all possible. If you can't, I mean, you can, do your best to have things in nice folders and nice containers, but anything aging, these are just again, maybe too in the weeds, it's chemical reactions that are happening. And if you remember from like high school chemistry, any chemical reaction that's happening, if the temperature is higher, everything's going to happen faster. And so in a space that's not climate controlled, where there may be more humidity, so that's more water is available, more temperature, it's just all those chemical reactions of things aging are just going to happen a little bit faster. But most of the things we have in the collections here at the library, we have books that are 500 years old, and they didn't spend all 500 of those years in a climate controlled space, obviously, and they're still here. So, you know, materials vary, but it's the best you can do is still worth doing. And so don't feel like just because you can't do the very best standard that it's not worth trying to do a little bit. Maybe in a few years or they're passed on to someone else in the future, that person is able to store them in better conditions. I think, you just do the best you can.
I did mention this earlier, but if you must store in a garage, make sure that they're stored off the ground on shelving, just in case there's any kind of flood or water event. But yeah.
Okay, trying to watch the time here. We've got 8 minutes. There's just some similar questions, so I want to focus on ones that are different. Okay, in a garage. Best way to store posters and handbills from old rock concerts, mostly the 60s. I think the question we answered earlier about oversized items is similar. If you're able to store things in flat files or keep things flat, it's great. Flat file cabinets, keeping things in folders. You may have screen printed posters from that time period. If you're familiar with screen printing or feel like you can identify that, those can have sometimes a really sensitive surface that can get scratched really easily. But in any case, if these are important to you and valuable to you, you'll want to handle them with care. Yeah, keep them in folders, keep them out of light. Someone's asking about scanning to save, storing hundreds of paper photos, economic, least time consuming way to do this. Well, the least time consuming would be to hire someone else to do it, but that's not the most economic. Yeah, I mean, on a home scanner, that's something I don't know that might be like you get one of two of like fastest and cheapest, and good quality. It's like everything, right? You only get two of those three, I think. So, if you want quality and fast and cheap, it may not be possible to have all three of those. So you could get a home scanner that can scan at a good resolution, doesn't cost you any money, but it might take a long time. If you want it to not take any of your time, you could hire someone to do it, but it costs more money, etc. I don't know. Maybe there's not an answer to your question or someone else has ideas, but yeah, it is possible to do these things yourself. It may take some time.
Adobe Bridge is a good program for managing your collections of digitized documents and adding metadata to them. And by
Yeah.
metadata, I mean additional information like who's in the photo, where it
Yeah.
was taken, date.
Yeah, but not
So
economical to
not
pay for
not
a subscription to Adobe Creative Suite. So
not necessarily economical.
yeah. But I think, if like budget is the limiting factor, then just you do as much as you can and kind of break up the project over time so it's not too overwhelming. Maybe you kind of do a few each week. Some scanning, if you're buying a scanner, if you don't already have one, maybe you can find one with software that lets you scan several photos all at once. And Patrick will talk more about this. I don't know why I'm getting so much into digitizing, but yeah, with digitizing photos. Okay, how are we on time? We got 5 minutes.
There is a question that came into the chat,
Okay.
just to hosts and panelists, so everyone didn't see
Oh,
this.
that's a good one.
If you have a 3-page letter handwritten from the 1950s, should you take out the letter? Should you take the letter out of the envelope and keep it flat? And if you keep it flat, should you separate the pages with non-acidic paper?
I would not. Because I would like having the object as it is.
Yeah.
I mean, a library might do that. But for me, I want it to kind of feel like the original object and, be able to have that experience of opening it up. But if it's, at least was saying about paper quality changing over time, if that paper is so brittle that when you unfold it, it just wants to break, then, that might affect it. But a lot of times stationery paper's not too bad. And so if it still seems like it's not falling apart when you handle it, I would get a digital copy. So if you want to show it to people, they can just look at the scanned copy. But yeah, I think kind of keeping that original format of the letter and the envelope, and I think it's kind of nice.
It probably is too obvious to say, but of course keep the envelope because there's lots of interesting information on that object as well, even if you do choose to take the letter out and keep it flat.
Yeah.
And no need to interleave with non-acidic paper per se, no,
Yeah. And the envelope, the letter and the envelope can just go in a folder also.
together.
Someone has asked a small hand signed poster that I'd like to frame and hang on my wall, tips of type of frame, glass, etc. to use. Yeah, framing, we may not have time to get into framing today. And I understand wanting to do framing yourself because it's very expensive. And also a lot of framers don't use conservation quality materials. They may stick tape directly onto your collections. They may spray mount things. So, if you have the funds looking for, conservation grade framing, but that might be a topic for another workshop. But yeah, avoiding putting sticky adhesives like tape directly on your materials. There's other ways to secure things in frames that are more reversible and safe, but framing is a professional occupation that requires a lot of training, and jumping into it for the first time for something that's really important to you might be difficult to do successfully. You may already be experienced in those things. I don't mean to assume about your level of experience, but it can be challenging to do yourself. We got a couple minutes. I'm sure I've missed some things. Outside of papers, photos, letters, books that have personal and sentimental value, are there some obvious examples of older paper artifacts you have that are worth preserving and original? Papers, photos, books, letters. I guess I'm not sure if you have something specific in mind here. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. I feel like papers encompasses anything that's on paper, but I don't know. I'll keep thinking about that. Someone's asking about an alternative to photo corners. I mean, the alternatives are the things that we don't recommend, which is gluing things, taping things. If you're trying to mount things in an album, that's the least damaging option. I mean, you can buy albums that have pockets in them, but those plastics may not be stable. One other quick thing I'll mention at the last minute for photo corners. This came up the last time we did this workshop. If you've got older photographs that are really brittle, that means they kind of, if you try to flex them, they could break. You want to be careful about if you put those in photo corners, you might want to stick the corners on, like, tuck the corners onto the photo and then put it in place, and not be trying to like flex the photo to fit into the corners or removing it if it's old and fragile. Just something to know about photo corners. Elise, you got anything else to add before we hand it over to Patrick?
Um, there are, I can't remember the company that manufactures it, but there are hinges that you can get, but they do require adhering a paper strip to the back of your photograph. So if you really don't want to use photo corners, that is there are some hinging products that are, not as bad as a glue stick or not as bad as the sticky photo album that Michelle was
Yeah.
talking about. But yeah, photo corners are
Yeah.
what we
But then
recommend.
you've lost access to the back if there's
Right.
things written on it. You could make reproductions and then stick them on however you want. That's another option. All right. Well, feel free to keep sending book and paper related questions into the Q&A. If we have extra time at the end, we'll answer them. And we can also try to include them in an email possibly. But we're going to hand it over to Patrick now, who's going to talk about digital preservation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right. Take it away, Patrick.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle and Elise. That was a fantastic presentation. Let me share my PowerPoint. And everyone can see my PowerPoint, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. So hello, good afternoon. My name is Patrick, and I'm one of the digitization projects librarians here with the Digi Center at the San Francisco Public Library. I'm going to talk today about digital preservation best practices for small and personal archives. But before I get going here, I wanted to circle back to a few of the questions that people posted about an hour ago, and I just want to know it's not getting lost in the shuffle or anything. Um, Susan posted it at the beginning of the presentation today about how does a solid state flash drive rank as a choice for long-term quality storage? And I would say a solid state flash drive, we'll talk about it a bit later on in the presentation, is the industry standard now. So if you can get a good mid-range solid state flash drive, that's pretty much a very solid option to store your digital material at that point. And Tom mentioned about Konica 3.5-inch diskettes from 1997. Unfortunately, KQP is a proprietary file software from Konica, so hence it's a lot difficult to open those files. If you did an internet search, there's plenty, not plenty, but there's a handful of different programs out there that will allow you to save that proprietary software either as a JPEG or a TIFF. I can't recommend any of them per se, but some quick internet research will definitely pop out various options for you to go to convert that proprietary file into more of a TIFF or a JPEG to be able to view and share. Um, and then Susan's about copying videotape to a disk to be downloaded online. We'll talk about that further in the presentation. And John's question about recommended digitization systems for slides, we'll talk about that in the presentation as well. If I don't touch on it or you want a little more in depth, feel free to put in another question into the Q&A and I will get to it. So on screen here are the 5 broad topics we'll discuss in this presentation. The first is why digitize physical material. We'll talk about born digital material, the digital preservation process itself, recommended file formats, and then finally digital storage options. So why is it important to digitize physical material? The answer to that question is twofold: preservation and access. So preservation leads to less handling of the original equals reduced potential for damage, which is pretty straightforward. The less you handle that physical material, the less likely it's going to be damaged. But it also leads to longevity. But the longevity comes with a caveat. It's only if you're prepared to migrate digitized material from one generation of technology to the next. So for example, if you had all of your material saved on 3x5 floppies and haven't touched it in 2 decades, you're probably going to be in a world of hurt. So it's not only digitizing it, but also migrating it as technology improves. The second is access. Digitizing the physical material improves access for oversized or fragile materials. It creates opportunities to share, and it increases overall exposure of the material. You can share it easily, whereas the physical material is only at one place at one time. But this is just a reminder that digitization is only part of digital preservation, while digital preservation encompasses far more than just digitization. Digital preservation includes storage, integrity monitoring, which just means periodically checking the files to make sure they're free of corruption, and keeping files in up-to-date digital formats, all of which we'll discuss further on in the presentation. Digital preservation is not a monthly backup, a thumb drive, a single event, or forever. In addition to physical material, we have what is called born digital material. So born digital items are material which are originally created in a digital format. Examples can include websites, email, digital photographs, video, electronic records, and much more. And I wanted to pose a question just to think about as you leave this workshop today, and you go back and you start thinking about your collections of what kind of born digital material do you work with that you feel would need preservation? So let's now turn to breaking down the digital preservation process. Like any successful project, it all starts with making a plan. There are 6 main buckets in the digital preservation process. The first bucket is planning and identifying. So when you're planning and identifying, you want to select the material you want to keep over the long term. You want to know what you have, and you want to figure out if the items themselves need treatment or specialized preparation before they can be digitized. Pretty much what Michelle and Elise were talking about earlier in our presentation today. At this point, you want to keep in mind the material that you have to keep, i.e. that material if lost would cause personal or professional problems, versus material you want to keep, i.e. if lost it would be upsetting but not critical, versus material that doesn't fall into either of those categories. The second bucket is deciding and gathering. So you want to gather the relevant digital files or physical material. After identifying which material you would like to preserve, you want to locate and gather born digital files into a central location, as I mentioned earlier, specifically an external drive or drives, depending on how many files you have. And for physical material, you want to sort it by type. You want your audiovisual, your print, your photos, etc., in preparation to digitize. It's important to also remember at this point that not every physical item needs to be digitized, and not every born digital file needs to be archived. And I think before we actually get to the digitization of physical material, let me pull up any, if there are any chats, or if anyone can let me know if there was a chat or a question that popped up. Doesn't look like it. Okay. Oh. So I want to say if Michelle or Elise or Emily, if anyone has you see a question in the chat, just please let me know. I
Patrick,
don't.
are you able to see the Q&A right
I can
now?
I can see
Okay.
the Q&A, but I can't see the chat. So if
Okay,
anything
got
does
it.
come up in chat, just go ahead and let me know.
Got it. Will do.
Okay, perfect. So the third bucket of digitization is the actual digitization of that physical material. So at this point, you want to figure out if you want to do it yourself or outsource it. So depending on your knowledge or resources, you can digitize the material yourself at home with proper equipment. You can send it to an outside vendor, or you can make use of various free memory labs around the Bay Area or in your locale. Budget versus time versus expertise. So these factors play a big role in your decision on whether to digitize the material yourself or outsource. This step can be the most daunting for an individual with limited experience with digital and or analog technology. But that's fine. If you want to take the DIY step, there are many online guides and tutorials to help answer questions. In addition, the staff here at the Digi Center or your local public library system can also be a valuable resource. And lastly, keep in mind that digitization is usually in real time. So if that VHS tape is 2 hours long or that audio cassette is 60 minutes, it will take that long to digitize it. For film, a 3-minute 8mm clip would take about 30 to 40 minutes to digitize. This table describes some of the basic components needed for a home digitization lab. Most of the hardware, software, cables, etc., can be found on various electronic marketplaces like Newegg, Amazon, eBay, etc. eBay, local thrift stores, yard estate sales are also all very good sources to find old analog hardware. So on this table here are the 5 most common analog types that we see here at the library that patrons bring in to digitize. If you were digitizing videotape, you will need an analog to digital converter, capture software, hardware, and cables. So for videotape, Elgato and Blackmagic are the 2 most popular brands on the market for an analog to digital converter. For capture software, Elgato makes an all-in-one. It has an analog to digital converter and the software together. Virtual Dub and Bandicam are also 2 very popular software as well. In addition to that, you'll need the old analog hardware of whatever media you're digitizing, whether that be a VCR, a DV cam, a camcorder, etc. And then you'll also need these specific cables if that hardware doesn't come with it. A BNC, an S-Video, an RCA, USB. Those old yellow, red, white audio video cables that we all had back in the 80s, those will come back into play here as well. For audio tape, you'll need a 3.5mm audio jack to USB adapter. You'll need a cassette deck to play your old tape. And then for the capture software, if you are in a Mac environment, we recommend GarageBand. It is free. And if you're in a PC environment, Audacity is another free software to use as well. And then various USB cables. If you have old floppy drives, if you have old DVDs, CDs with data on it, it is possible to migrate that software from one to the other. They make plenty of external optical or disk drives. Again, searching on the internet, you can find some. They'll come with a handy USB drive to plug in your computer. For files that are on your 3x5 floppy or your CD, you shouldn't need any capture software. You should just be able to drag and drop the files over onto your new solid state drive or your thumb drive, wherever you're moving this data towards. But if you are dealing with DVDs or video that was on a DVD, you will need some capture software for that. Here at the library, we use Handbrake, but VLC Media Player is also a good option to go with. If you have old Super 8, 8mm, even 16mm film that you want to digitize, a couple of companies do make hardware for that. Wolverine and RetroScan. You'll purchase the hardware, it'll plug into your computer. It should come with the reels, and it will go ahead and frame by frame digitize your film. So all the cables and the hardware should all come with the Wolverine or RetroScan hardware that you purchase. And then finally, documents, photos, slides, transparencies. You'll need a flatbed scanner, depending on your budget and your knowledge. Some are very expensive and they can do a lot of work. And there are some that are mid-range. Some of you might already have it at home. And most of these flatbed scanners will come with proprietary software. So if you get an Epson, it should come with Epson Scan. So you'll be able to use the scanning software that's already included. If you have a flatbed scanner that doesn't come with software or it costs too much to add that software to your computer, there are free options out there. Adobe does make a free PDF reader. If you want to scan a PDF, you can go ahead and use that. ViewScan's another one. And as with the film, most of the cables should come with the hardware you purchase. In addition to what's on this table, Just some other equipment to consider is obviously computer and laptop, preferably within 3 to 5 years. You want to have a newish computer because sometimes digitizing a lot of this material is hard on the computer. So you want at least 3 to 5 year range. If you're building a pretty extensive home lab, you'll probably want to invest in USB hubs, which are 4 to 6 USB outlets that you can plug into, and that'll plug into the back of your machine. Again, it depends how big your lab is. You might want to invest in some extra USB, USB-C, S-video cables. And if you are going to take your material to a memory lab to digitize, you'll want to invest in some thumb drives so you can bring that data back to you and back to your home when you're done. I guess I'll stop there, see if any questions came into the chat. Catherine had a question about free memory labs. What and where are these, please? It depends on where you live, but here in the SFPL, we have a DIY Digi Lab that if you can go ahead and do a Google search for that and it should come up. We offer appointments, 3-hour windows, 4 days a week. It's hot or cold on how popular they are. Sometimes they're really popular. It's very difficult to get an appointment, sometimes not as much. So we just recommend that you keep trying. Other places in the Bay Area, I know Sonoma County has a memory lab, San Mateo County has a memory lab as well. So just searching around your local public libraries, a lot of them do have memory labs for patrons to come in and digitize their material. Okay, so moving on. So every year the Library of Congress updates their recommended format statement for both physical and digital formats. These recommendations maximize the chances of file survival and continued accessibility of the content well into the future. So here are the Library of Congress recommended file types for the 4 most digitized media types. Keep in mind that this is just a sample of the multitude of file types. Text in this case will be books and/or documents. Again, we mentioned earlier, don't feel like you need to write all this down. There will be PDF copies of this presentation sent to everyone. But just for reference, if you are scanning black and white text, it's recommended for 1 bit depth, bitonal, which is just black and white color, a minimum resolution of 300 ppi, a 1:1 scale, and saved as either an uncompressed TIFF or a PDF. For black and white text with illustrations, they recommend 24-bit depth, RGB, which is color, 400 ppi, a 1:1 scale, and again, a TIFF, uncompressed, or a PDF. And then if you have handwritten text, someone has a diary, or there's text in the margins that was mentioned earlier, 8-bit depth is recommended, grayscale, minimum resolution of 400 ppi, 1:1 scale, and an uncompressed TIFF or PDF. Most of these options, when you do go to your flatbed scan, either at a library or at home, when you see the options, you will have the options to select all of these. So don't feel like it'll be pretty straightforward when you select the minimum resolution, your color, your bit depth, etc. These are just what Library of Congress recommends as the minimum that you should save your files as. For images, if you have a black and white photograph, they recommend 8-bit depth, grayscale color, resolution minimum of 400 ppi, 1:1 scale, and an uncompressed TIFF for all of these in this table. For color photos, 24-bit depth, RGB color, 400 ppi, 1:1 scale. And I saw a few people mention about slides and negatives. Most flatbed scanners should come with a slide deck. Usually it's 12 to 15 holders where you can put individual slides into them, and it'll scan it all at once and then save at 12 or 15 individual files at the end. But as you're going through the scan, these would be the options you want to select. So if it's a black and white negative or slide, you want 8-bit, grayscale, 2400 ppi, 1:1 ratio, uncompressed TIFF. For color slides, again, 24-bit color depth, RGB, 2400 PPI, 1:1 resolution. For audio, the vast majority of them are going to be audio cassette, which is 16-bit. You want a 44.1 gigahertz frequency and to be saved as a wave format. And then for very rare, you have reel-to-reel or analog discs, which would be 24-bit, 48 gigahertz to 96 gigahertz, and saved as a wave format. And then lastly, for video, these are the most popular video film that we see: VHS, Betamax, Betacam, U-matic, DV cam, mini DV, i8, Video 8, etc. They should all be audio at 48 gigahertz, 16-bit. You shouldn't feel like you need to upscale it to high definition. Standard definition of 720, 480 is more than sufficient. And you'd want to save it as a QuickTime movie. For film, 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter Super 8, same thing as the VHS. Standard def is perfectly fine, and you want to save it as a QuickTime video file. One final quick note on file size and deciding on what file format to select. If the amount of data you're creating exceeds your storage budget, you might consider the compression of your image and AV files. So lossy compression means that small amounts of information will be lost over time. So formats like JPEG for images and MP3, MP4s for AV, they utilize lossy compression, but are smaller and easier to manage. So sometimes if you're saving video and photos, they can be saving very huge file sizes, which could come into play depending on how much storage budget you have. So lossless compression, as we've talked about in these slides, TIFFs, wave formats, they result in very large files, but you can definitely move them around without worrying about the file becoming corrupted. That's not to say JPEGs and MP3, MP4 are bad. If you save them at that and don't touch them, they're perfectly fine. But if you're using them, opening them, moving them around, sharing them a lot, they do have higher probability of becoming corrupted over time. Let's see. I think I'll stop here and see if there's any more questions. Don had a question about wire recording preservation. With that, I would definitely recommend finding a preservation company that will help with that. That's a little more complicated than doing that yourself. So if means and time allows for it, I don't know where you live, but definitely in an internet search, we'll find some local preservation companies that will definitely help with that. I don't know cost offhand, but that would definitely be your best way to go for wire recording preservation. One of the questions was, we don't understand all your acronyms. So RBG is when you're printing, that's just color. You just want to select color. You usually have a grayscale, color, black and white. And TIFF is a file format that you save images as. Same as you save a Word document as a Word document, a PDF as a PDF. You want to save your scanned image files as TIFF or JPEG. Those are the two most popular industry standards. And Catherine had a question about, are people around at the DigiLab to help? Yes, so there'll be staff on site. You would come in, you sign a release. We'll give a quick overview of whatever you're bringing in to digitize, how to use the analog hardware. And we're here to help troubleshoot, but we're not here to do the digitization for you. We're here as more of a resource. So if you do come in, we can help you, but we can't sit there and do the actual conversion for you. All All right, so transitioning from physical to born digital material. These are the four most common archived born digital file types. Um, Obviously, the number one is email. We get that question an awful lot. So you can do it two ways. You can use an email archiving tool like MailStore. It is for the entry level should be free. Or you can export your entire account from if you have a Gmail, if you're on Outlook, if you're on Yahoo, or most other mainstream email services, you can export all of your emails as mbox files. It's more for just having it for an archive. You're not going to open them up all the time, but they are a very solid, stable file type to store it long term. For websites, you can use a website crawler. The Internet Archive uses the Wayback Machine. Another company called Preservica does this as well, and they export as WARC files, which is just the industry standard of storing the website crawl. If it's your personal website, you'll want to save your files as HTML. For electronic files, if you have documents, if you have Word documents, Google Docs, anything like that, you want to try to save them as PDF. That's an industry standard. You're able to maintain the integrity of that document over a long period of time with that. If you have a data set, whether it be an Excel or other forms of data sets, you'd want to save them as CSV or Excel files. And then if you have photos, videos you took on your cell phone or your tablet, you want to save them in the same format as you would the digitized physical files. For most of us on our phone, the resolution is going to be way more than you're going to get even using a scanner. So that's usually going to be good to go. So you just want, if you want to export those off your phone, you want to save them as TIFFs or JPEGs. And then the last one is social media. This one is hard to say because it's so difficult to archive it just because of the scrolling algorithm that you see on your screen. If we're talking specifically about only your tweets or your posts on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, all of those companies will allow you to download an archive of your data. That should never be a problem. It should be under your account, under the options under your account. You should be able to download every tweet you've sent, every post, etc. If you were trying to archive what your tweet or your post look like online, that becomes a little more difficult. You could try to make use of a web crawler, the same way you would do your website, and that should be able to save any given page at any given moment when you crawl it. But it definitely is a lot more difficult and a lot more frustrating. I notice on our end when we try to crawl different social media that's associated with the SFPL, it's very hit or miss. So if you try to do that, don't feel frustrated. We're all having the same problem with that. And then to circle back, the fourth bucket of the digital preservation process is file organization and naming. This step can be started depending on the size and variety of your files and or the organization of the individual at the very beginning of your project up until you begin digitizing your physical material or aggregating your born digital files. It's important to create a file naming convention. This is a set way or pattern for constructing file names. It should be determined before you begin creating digital files to ensure consistency and organization. And you also want to use best practices for file naming. You want to use descriptive names to identify the content and purpose of your files. You want to avoid special characters. You want to avoid periods and commas. You want to avoid spaces in your file names. You want to use dashes between the words instead. You want to save preferably in lowercase, and you want to try to limit the length of your file name to 27 characters. That's all best practice. That's all fancy wording. You personal at home, the best advice I could say is you want to organize your subfolders and files in a way that makes sense to you. When you start to digitize all of this materials you can see on the screen, you're going to get 50, 100, 1,000 files. You want to be able to find a way to name them and to store them in a way that you're going to be able to access them easily in the future. So if you went to Disneyland in 1993 and you're digitizing all that material, you'd want to create a subfolder that says Disneyland 1993 and put everything in there. You want to make it obvious for you, but also for someone else, whether it's a small business you're running, whether it's a spouse, a child, family member, someone who wants to dig in this as well, they want to be able to understand your file naming. So that's very important. And be descriptive and consistent with whatever naming convention you select. So really, there's best practices the Library of Congress can say, but in the end, it's what is the best practice for you. How are you going to store this material? How are you going to access it? How are you going to share it? That's the most important. The final two buckets of the process are backing up your files and the maintenance of them. So for backing up your files, the best practice is a 3-2-1 rule. You want to make 3 copies. Your main computer can count as 1 copy, but you should make 2 additional copies in case one backup fails. You want to use 2 different types of media storage, as not to rely on the endurance of one type of storage format. This can include cloud storage. And you want to store 1 backup in a different location. This addresses geographic and building risks, and that copy should be kept off-site and offline. And the last thing is you want to maintain and migrate. So digital preservation requires active maintenance over time to ensure the digital files remain accessible. You want to migrate every 5 to 7 years to mitigate the risks of obsolescence, i.e. hardware or software no longer supported. You also want to check your storage annually. You don't want to wait for your computer to crash or your hard drive to crash to discover that your storage has failed as well. You want to connect your storage media and open up a few random files to test that they're still accessible. Additionally, you can consider creating and regularly checking checksums, which are just digital signatures to ensure that your files don't change or become corrupted over time. Checksums can be generated by several different utilities, and they can be stored with your files. So it's a passive program that will maintain that your files are the same file size as they were when you saved them. Again, an optional thing, but something if you are more technologically sound and you're more worried about your files as years goes along, it's something to look into. Let's see if we have any more questions. Lori had one, the software that can find duplicates, group automatically by face, and scour hard drives for photos. That's a good question. A little more in depth on that. If you could, I would like you to email me. We're going to put the Digi Center email in the chat, so that might be the best way to contact me, so I can do a little more research on that. I know there's software, but I don't want to just shoot off the hip with that and send you down the wrong direction. And Emily, I think the other questions we've kind of answered as we've gone along. One last note on digital storage options for digital files. There are multiple ways to store long-term with their own pros and cons. The first and the easiest would be external hard drives. Solid state drive is preferable. Look for quality, not the cheapest. You don't need to go out and buy a $500 solid state drive, but you also don't want to go and buy a $10 one. The hardware in these are important. They will crash if you go cheap. There's plenty of times I've seen people plug in a drive and it just doesn't show up on the computer anymore. So look for quality. Don't cheap out on this. This is very important when you're storing your files. And the same thing for thumb drives. If you're going to go to a digital lab and scan and bring that back home, don't buy a pack of 10 for $10. They're going to fail. You want to look for stuff that has high quality, good reviews from a reputable manufacturer. Um, so just keep that in mind as you're purchasing. For cloud-based options, it depends on what universe you're living in. For those of us who are Android, most of our stuff is already on Google Drive. I think they give 15 megs for free, and you could pay for more if you want, depending on your size of your archive and how much material you have. For people in the Mac world, most of your stuff's already on iCloud automatically. Again, they'll give you a certain level of data storage for free, and any more than that, you'd have to pay a monthly fee. Um, for those of you who don't want to use either Google or Apple, pCloud is probably the most recommended one. It's out of Europe. It's pretty inexpensive. They give you a ton of storage, and it's won awards for being one of the most secure platforms out there. So you don't have to worry about your storage being stolen or the servers going down, etc. And lastly, there are private server options. So if you are more technologically advanced, you know someone who is, or you just want more control over your media, you can pay to have a private network set up. Synology, Nextcloud, Plex are all companies that will provide you with a local network that you can move your material to, and then you can share those files with anyone else you want. So you're paying for your own private, secure cloud storage. So that's another option as well. And then lastly, here are a few additional digitization resources as you begin any future preservation projects. So the Library of Congress is probably the best place to start. They have a great personal archiving website that's listed here. They do a great job of answering any really basic questions and kind of outline step by step of the archiving process. The Library of Congress also creates that recommended format specifications that I spoke about earlier. That website will take you to a PDF of it, an HTML, all kinds of whatever option you want to view it as. And they have every physical and digital file type you can think of and how the minimum format specifications you should save your files as. The National Archives has a collection of resources and best practices in relation to physical and digital preservation. So not only stuff that I've talked about, but stuff that Michelle and Elise talked about earlier today. And then lastly, the Sustainable Heritage Network has a series of free online courses developed for community-centered curation of digital collections. So it can be small or personal collections. They offer free courses that will go way more in depth than I did today about individual specific digitization processes. And that's all that I got today. We'll take a look at the Q&A and see if anything popped up or any questions.
Patrick, there is one in the chat. Someone's asking
Sure.
about Microsoft OneDrive for cloud storage, I think.
Yeah, Microsoft OneDrive's great as well. If you're already on that and you enjoy it, stay with it. Same thing with Google Drive, the iCloud. Anywhere you're already on and you're comfortable with it, there's no reason to migrate unless you choose to.
So we'll give a few minutes for more digital preservation questions. But since we've got more time, if people had more book and paper questions, Elise and I can answer those too. So we'll give a couple minutes for people to think of their questions. Especially if you asked something earlier and you felt like we didn't get to your question, please send it again.
I see a question from Lynn. I have taken photos of photos on my iPhone. Quality, practicality.
Um, the quality is not going to be as good as if you take that image and scan it. Practicality, yeah, it's super practical. It saves time, but you have it right there. It's usable. I wouldn't say it's archival quality, but it's something you could do. But if you do have the scanner, I would recommend that you scan those old physical photos if you can.
I think Emily's probably working on it, but if you could drop the Digi Center email on the chat, Emily, somebody has reminded us about that. So the Digi Center email is in the chat now, and also my email and Emily's email from preservation if you have book and paper preservation questions.
See that Jennifer had a question about migrating between types of cloud drives. Yeah, that's possible. It's like migrating from one piece of software to the other. It just depends on how big your storage is on that cloud drive. It might take a lot of time. If you are going from one to the other, I would recommend at that point to go ahead and buy a drive and go ahead and download to that drive as well, just so you can have a secondary place where all your media is stored at that time. And then at that point, you can upload it to whatever cloud storage you want at that point.
Patrick, if you want to stop sharing, maybe it'll be easier for you to see the chat too
Sure.
if you want to have your screen back. We can just have us up here. Someone did ask, did you see the question in the chat, Patrick? Do you recommend getting a separate scanner for slides and negatives or a better scanner that has those abilities?
A good quality flatbed scanner, you should be able to scan everything on it. Slides, negatives, photos, documents, etc. You shouldn't need a separate one for that.
And someone in the Q&A asked, are any places interested in slides from Russia, Egypt, Lebanon, etc. from the 60s, or just toss them? I would say it would depend on if these are images that you took or a family member took, if they're original images, or if they're, like something that was purchased in a pack of kind of like someone else's images that might exist elsewhere. If they're originals, depending on the context, they could be of interest. Patrick, do you have ideas about that? That might be more a question for our photo curator at the library.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It depends on where you live. I mean, you can always contact your local library to see if they want to put that in their collection. Local university might want it. Depends on what their collection policy is. It's hard to say.
Mhm.
Jason,
Disposing of old
yeah,
slides. Did you see that one? I don't know that there's anything special about that. It's just plastic and pigment and paper.
yeah.
There's nothing. Yeah. So trash should be fine. But I would say you could donate them to Scrap if you live in San Francisco, or the East Bay Depot for creative reuse if you're in the East Bay, because people love to use them for crafts, and I've used them for art projects. So if it's not something personally sensitive, um, there are artists and people who would reuse them.
Jason had a question about some old hard drives. Yeah, I think your best bet at that point, seeing as they're 30, 20 years old, you'd probably want to take it to a local preservationist and see if they can pull anything out of it. I don't think it's something you can connect to your current PC or Mac. Even I would assume that the connections are even changed that much. So I definitely recommend taking it to a professional at that point and see what they can pull off it. And then converting phone JPEGs to TIFF, it's viable. You'll definitely need some software for that if you have it on your computer. You could download it as JPEGs and then save it as a TIFF. Obviously, I don't know what kind of machine you have for software, but if you have Photoshop or anything like that, would be your best bet.
Patrick, do you know, I feel like if you're scanning to a TIFF, it's nice because you can capture more information with a TIFF.
Mhm.
But if your image is already digital and it's a JPEG,
Yeah,
converting it to a TIFF isn't going to create new information that isn't there. So you may
no,
just be making your file bigger without really any added benefits. But I mean, a TIFF could last longer than a JPEG, perhaps, but a JPEG is still a pretty stable storage format? Just before you go convert all your JPEGs to TIFFs, I'm not sure about the benefit of that.
Yeah, I mean, if you are running an archive, yeah, you'd want to do that. But
Yeah.
just for your own personal, I mean, they do create larger files. They do create more stable files. I mean,
Okay.
especially if you're going to be moving them around. But yeah, the resolution that most of our phones take is so high. I mean, and you don't have to worry about upscaling at all. Just downloading and saving as a JPEG should be more than enough for everyone's personal storage.
And I remember this coming up in the in-person workshop, but I don't know if you mentioned it today, but about how iPhones will often be automatically set to take photos in the HEIC format. I think that's what
I
it's called.
I believe
Um,
so. I believe
and
so.
so you may want to change your settings to shoot in JPEG, um, is an option rather than the proprietary
Yeah.
compressed Apple format.
Yes, Apple will always keep you in Apple's orbit if they can.
And that's something you could Google if you're
Yeah.
not sure how to find those settings, is, how to change your iPhone to shoot JPEGs.
Yeah.
Do you see this additional question? I don't know if this is the same person who was asking about converting JPEGs to TIFFs, wondering about loss of res. Do you see that question, Patrick?
You shouldn't lose any resolution converting from JPEG to TIFF, if that's the question.
And the
But
question about, oh, go ahead, Patrick.
I was just gonna say a lot of stuff I talked about today is best practices, very high end, you know, for most of us here. I mean, myself personally, I can't speak for you, Michelle. I mean, I mean, all of my photos are still JPEGs. I'm not saving them as TIFFs. I'm not
Yeah.
doing all this. This is if you really have something, you really want to save for decades and decades and decades. Um, if it's just a selfie, something like that, a high res JPEG, which already stored at is perfectly fine.
Someone's asking, can you recommend a program or process to store photos and the pencil or pen marks on the reverse sides together? Elise was mentioning earlier about Bridge. If you already have the Adobe Creative Suite, Bridge is kind of like a file explorer type program that makes it really easy to add metadata to your files. This is getting a little bit more in the weeds, but you can add this kind of like information that goes along with the file. So you could type up that stuff from the back of the photos, but also just digitizing them, and then you have the back, and you could use your file naming to kind of group the front and back of something together. Are there other ways to kind of group files like that, Patrick, if you have the front and back of one image?
Um, Here in the archive, when we scan them, there'll be two files. You have the file the front, file the back, two TIFFs.
Someone's asked about preserving and storing blueprints. So earlier I talked about when things are too large for our flat file drawers, we store them rolled. And that's a big project we've been working on, all of us in the preservation unit, under the guidance of Emily. She's been helping us preserve some really big blueprints, which are of the old main library, which is now the Asian Art Museum. And these are getting rolled onto 6-inch tubes. I think that's right, Emily, after they've been repaired and lined. But they're too big to store flat. For digitizing them, yeah, how do you handle oversized digitization? Are y'all doing much of that, Patrick? Do you stitch things together or
If the archive,
digitally?
yeah, if the archive needs it upstairs, we have a DT camera. So you can lay it flat on the glass, it'll take it. And if it's really big, it'll take multiple photos and then we'll crop it all together to make one photo. It's like if it's a huge, poster or something like that. But that's like archival level type of situation.
All right. Well, we do still have another few minutes. So feel free to stick around if you have more questions. Someone else has mentioned you can take to a blueprint shop. I'm not sure if you mean for storage or for digitization. Um, yeah, it also might depend on how fragile your item is. If it's, over 100 years old, like the ones we're working on here, you know, someone might be sending it through a scanner that's got rollers that's just feeding through. So yeah, it might depend on the condition of where you would want to take something. And if you just have comments, putting them in the chat is better so everybody can see them rather than the Q&A, if you can. Just questions in the Q&A will help us out. Someone says, I have large format photos from my grandparents. Is that something I should take to a professional to photograph, or could I scan it in parts and stitch it?
Depends on how big it is. It's hard to say. We'd have to see them.
Yeah, I mean, handle it with care and see the results you get. And if you're not happy with the results, you could always take it to a professional, as long as it's not something you're worried you're going to damage just by trying to scan it. Photoshop, if you have that, has some nice tools for merging that work pretty well. We use that when we have to photograph things that we're repairing. If they're too big for our area, we'll merge things in Photoshop. Oh well, we got a bunch of questions in now. Scanner apps for phones.
Yeah, I mean, they're okay. I mean, they're not archive quality, but they're good enough. Again, it's hard to say. I don't want to recommend one thing or the other. If it works for you and it saves as a quality JPEG, it's fine.
Yeah, I think when people are asking about how they can digitize the blueprints, we don't know if someone's coming from a historical society where they're trying to preserve these for the long term, or if it's just, yeah, it depends on how you're using them. And
Yeah. The SSD drive format depends on what environment you're coming in. Most are plug and play, but if you need a format for a Mac, you would have to do that. Sometimes in the lab we run Macs, so sometimes if it's not pre formatted, we have to do it for them. But it just depends on what environment you're working in. And the 27 character limit on file names, that is, I mean, you could obviously put more. That's just the recommendation from the Library of Congress. I think it mostly has to do with being able to see the file name. Sometimes they're truncated when you open up your file storage. It just has to do with that as well. And I think it also has to do a lot of times on databases when they're searching. I think it has to do with their ability to parse files as well. Um, but for personal use, if you feel you need more on an individual level, there's no reason why you couldn't.
I know more questions might keep coming for those who are still here. We also wanted to offer, so we talked about how today is Ask a Conservator Day. If you use Instagram, we have a post on the SFPL Instagram today that's inviting people to ask questions about our work, but we're also happy to ask general questions about our jobs, the work we do, how we got into this type of work, about the preservation field, conservation field. So if you have those kinds of questions, we're happy to answer them as well. Oh, I see. There was a question in the chat that Emily also answered. A page in a book that's fragile, take a photo of it or put it on the scanner. Yeah, with fragile books, we're not like putting them open flat on a scanner and squishing the lid down. It can be really damaging to the bindings. So yeah, here in the library, Patrick's got a really fancy machine that can, the book can stay open like this, and there's a camera here and a camera there. If you've just got something on your own, those scanner apps on your phone could be a great option for that, of keeping the book open at a good angle. And yeah, and just taking a photo or scanning that way rather than flat on the scanning bed. Oh, okay. So two people have asked questions about how we got into preservation and what degree do you need? Well, depending on where you work, the education requirements can vary, but I think we can all maybe share about how we got the skills that we have. I'm already talking, so I can go. I have a master's degree in art conservation. I majored in library and archives conservation, but before I did that master's program, I um, went to undergrad art school for printmaking and book arts. And then I did a lot of internships under book conservators in different libraries to get training, which was required for my graduate program. I had to have experience already. And I also had to go back to school and take a lot of chemistry. But graduate school had theoretical components and hands-on components, additional internships for training. It's a lot of training in bookbinding, history of the book, material sciences, and had worked in a few different libraries, mostly academic libraries, before working here. Do you want to go, Elise?
Yeah, I don't recommend my pathway for people interested in getting into the field because I think I was very lucky. I have an MFA, a master's in fine arts degree in book arts, where I studied hand paper making and bookbinding and letterpress printing, as well as book history and also conservation while I was in school. And I also while I was doing my MFA, I worked in the library's conservation lab at the university, and so I got bench training that way, in addition to craft training through my master's in fine arts degree. But that is not necessarily the most common pathway that people take to get into the field these days. Really, it's a master's in art conservation, like Michelle has, that is much more common and expected today. What about you, Patrick?
Well, I don't consider myself a preservationist. Um, I got my MLIS and I got into archives when I was doing my MLIS. I started an internship at the photo archives at the NYPL, and started out there and then kind of bounced around and ended up here at the SFPL as a local branch librarian, and a position opened up here at the Digi Center, and I applied and got back into it.
Emily, do you want to join us with your video to share about your training?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so for me, I initially was in undergrad for fine arts and was doing a chemistry degree at the same time and just trying to figure out a way to combine the two. And art conservation was just a perfect mix there for me. So again, did a master's in art conservation, specializing in works on paper, and bounced around a little bit, working privately, working at private labs as well as museums, and that brought me to the library. And just following up on Christine's question about types of degrees, typically it is expected that you do have a master's specifically in art conservation now. For the library specifically, it is a combination of either a degree or the same amount of time in work experience. Internships and apprenticeships are becoming less and less common in the field, but are definitely still a viable way to enter into it.
Yeah, most places, if they require a degree, will say or equivalent experience. Because there's also like bookbinding training programs that some people do. And then they kind of learn the conservation skills through internships after doing like a formal bookbinding program. All right. Well, we got 1 minute left. If there are any quick questions, we could answer them, but I think that's going to be it. So we will email everyone who registered with a PDF of our slides. And yeah, if we think there's text that we need to share that isn't in the slides, we could include an additional PDF, but I think most of it should be in the slides. Maybe we can also share the links that we shared in the chat in addition. And the recording of this will be on YouTube, and we'll send out that link too. So that'll be around for a while. You can refer back to it. But yeah, there's still 60 people here. Thanks so much to everyone for attending. Sorry, Emily, go ahead.
Oh, just again, feel free to email us with any questions that you have specifically relating to your collections, your items. We are more than happy to help in any way we can.
All right. Thanks, everybody.